The Philippines, October 1944. Private Takeshi Yamamoto squats in the mud beside a bombed-out nipa hut, carefully opening his cloth ration pouch. Inside, a small mound of rice. He pours it into his mess tin, and rat droppings tumble out with the grain. He picks them out one by one. This is routine. The rice is unhusked, rough, dirty, mixed with bits of stalk and pebbles. It'll take him 20 minutes just to clean enough for a meal. When he's done, he'll have maybe 300 grams of edible rice for the entire day. His companion, Corporal Saito, dumps his own ration beside him. The fish is actually a dried fish head, eyes still intact, barely any meat on it. "Americans," Saito says, shaking his head with a grin. "You hear what the lieutenant said? They can't fight without their luxuries. Coffee, chocolate, like children." Yamamoto laughs, but his stomach growls. He hasn't felt full in 8 months. "Soft," he agrees. "How can such a weak people think they can defeat us?" They've been told this since training. The Americans are decadent, spoiled. They need comfort and abundance because they lack spiritual strength. The Japanese soldier, by contrast, is hardened by deprivation. His hunger makes him fierce. His suffering builds his soul. This is the official line. This is what Private Yamamoto believes, as he picks rat droppings from his rice and prepares another meal that will leave him hungry. But in a few weeks, he'll discover something that will shatter everything he's been told. He'll find out exactly what the Americans are eating, and it will break his faith in the Imperial Army forever. To understand what happened when Japanese soldiers finally saw American K-rations, you need to understand just how different these two military philosophies were. Because this wasn't just about food. It was about two completely different visions of how to fight a war. The Imperial Japanese Army's approach to feeding its soldiers was rooted in centuries of samurai tradition. Hardship builds character. Suffering purifies the spirit. A soldier who can endure hunger can endure anything. The official daily ration for a Japanese soldier in the Philippines in 1944 was 400 grams of rice, 100 grams of fish, 20 grams of sugar, 10 grams of oil. On paper, this sounds almost adequate. About 1,050 calories, but the reality was very different. First, that 400 grams of rice, it was unhusked. Rough rice. Paddy rice, as the Americans who later documented it called it. The husks alone accounted for 25% of the weight, so that 400 grams became 300 grams of actual edible rice. And that 300 grams came mixed with debris, bits of stalk, dirt, pebbles, and yes, rat droppings. Japanese soldiers had to spend precious time and energy picking through their rations just to make them edible. The 100 grams of fish, often just fish heads with the eyes still in them. Minimal meat, mostly bone and gristle. The sugar ration rarely appeared. The oil ration? Japanese soldiers joked that it was mythical. Some claimed to have seen it once. Most never did. And even these meager rations weren't guaranteed. Supply ships were being sunk by American submarines at an alarming rate. By late 1944, Japanese forces in the Philippines were cut off from regular resupply. The rice that was supposed to come from Vietnam never arrived. But here's what really tells you about the Japanese Army's approach to feeding its men. Even when food was available, it often didn't reach the soldiers. A Japanese soldier named Tetsuro Ogawa left detailed testimony about his time in the Philippines. He explained that while the official ration was limited to 400 grams per day, soldiers were expected to supplement this by taking what they needed from the local population. This wasn't foraging. This wasn't combat necessity. This was organized theft. Ogawa describes how he and his fellow soldiers would regularly snatch chickens, eggs, coconuts, pigs, papayas, and water buffalo from Filipino villages. Sometimes they left behind military scrip, worthless paper money. More often, they left nothing. The officers looked the other way. This was understood to be part of how you survived. The Filipino civilians? They were just obstacles, resources to be exploited. And still, the Japanese soldiers were hungry. Because even with systematic theft from local populations, there simply wasn't enough food. The supply situation was collapsing, and Japanese military doctrine had no answer except to tell soldiers that their hunger made them stronger. The physical effects were devastating. Beriberi, a disease caused by thiamine deficiency, was rampant in Japanese units. It causes weakness, burning sensations in the extremities, and heart failure. It was so common in the Japanese military that medical officers considered it normal. Night blindness from vitamin A deficiency left sentries unable to see in the dark. Burning feet and hands made marching agonizing. Edema, swelling caused by protein deficiency, left soldiers' faces and limbs bloated, even as they starved. Wounds healed slowly. Diseases hit harder. Combat effectiveness plummeted. But Japanese command maintained that this was acceptable, that deprivation built spiritual strength, that a hungry soldier was a fierce soldier. The Americans had a very different philosophy. The U.S. military's approach to rations was based on science, industrial capacity, and a very different kind of logic. Well-fed soldiers fight better. It sounds obvious, almost simplistic, but it represented a fundamental break from traditional military thinking. The Americans weren't interested in building character through suffering. They were interested in winning battles, and they'd figured out that soldiers with full stomachs, complete nutrition, and high morale performed better than starving ones. The American military-industrial complex treated soldier feeding as a logistics problem to be solved with the same intensity they applied to building tanks and bombers. Enter the K-ration. Developed in 1941 by Dr. Ansel Keys at the University of Minnesota, the K-ration was designed as a complete daily ration for paratroopers and other mobile forces. It needed to be lightweight, compact, durable, and nutritionally complete. Keys tested various combinations. He studied caloric density, vitamin content, protein requirements, and palatability. He field-tested prototypes with soldiers. He refined based on feedback. The result was a marvel of nutritional engineering packed into a box that could fit in a large pocket. Each K-ration came in 3 units: breakfast, dinner, and supper. The breakfast unit contained 1 can of meat, usually chopped ham and eggs, or veal loaf, 4 biscuits, enriched hardtack, 1 compressed cereal bar, or dried fruit bar, a packet of instant coffee, sugar tablets, 4 pieces of chewing gum, 4 cigarettes, toilet paper, matches, a wooden spoon, a can opener. The dinner and supper units contained different varieties of canned meat, cheese, processed American cheese, pork luncheon meat, beef and pork loaf, more biscuits, bouillon powder or lemon powder, dextrose tablets, quick energy, salt tablets, more gum, more cigarettes, can opener. All of it packed in waterproofed cardboard boxes designed to be opened quietly. The total daily ration, all 3 units combined, provided approximately 3,000 calories. Let that sink in for a moment. 3,000 calories. In portable form. For every soldier. Every day. That's roughly double what Japanese soldiers were getting. And the American ration included complete proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Everything needed for sustained combat operations. But here's what really demonstrates the gap between American and Japanese military thinking. The K ration wasn't even considered particularly good by American standards. Soldiers complained about them, called them monotonous, griped about the same menu options day after day. When given the choice, American troops preferred C rations or hot meals from field kitchens. The K ration was considered an emergency field ration, something you ate when nothing better was available. And it was still better than what Japanese soldiers received as their standard official daily ration. The logistics behind getting K rations to the front lines was equally impressive. Ships brought thousands of tons of them across the Pacific. Distribution networks delivered them to forward supply dumps. Even units in active combat received regular resupply. By late 1944, the American supply chain in the Pacific was so efficient that frontline units sometimes had surplus rations. Soldiers gave away K rations to local civilians, left them behind during tactical movements. The contrast couldn't be sharper. Japanese soldiers stealing food from starving Filipino civilians. American soldiers handing out surplus rations to those same civilians. One military saw logistics as someone else's problem. The other built the most sophisticated supply system in human history. But Japanese soldiers didn't know any of this. They'd been told the Americans were soft, weak, dependent on luxury, because they lacked the spiritual strength to endure hardship. They believed it until they saw the rations for themselves. The moment came in different ways for different units. Sometimes during organized retreats, when Japanese forces moved into positions Americans had just abandoned. Sometimes after small-scale skirmishes, when Japanese patrols found supply caches. But the reaction was always the same: disbelief, then shock, then a kind of dawning horror as they did the math. Let me paint you a specific picture, drawn from multiple accounts. A Japanese infantry unit, maybe 20 men, pushes through dense jungle in northern Luzon. It's January 1945. They've been on quarter rations for 2 months. 3 men have died of malnutrition-related diseases in the past week. The rest are gaunt, weak, moving slowly. They come upon an abandoned American position. Recent. The foxholes still smell of cigarette smoke. Discarded equipment scattered around. And then they see the boxes, stacked on a wooden pallet, partially covered with a tarp. Dozens of small cardboard boxes with English writing and a large K stamped on the side. The unit's sergeant approaches cautiously, checks for booby traps. Finding none, he picks up a box and examines it. It's light, compact. He can't read the English, but there are pictures on the side. Food. He tears it open. Inside, nested together, 3 smaller boxes. He opens one, pulls out a small can. The label shows meat. He uses his bayonet to pry it open. Pork loaf, seasoned and preserved, glistening with fat. The smell makes his mouth water involuntarily. There's more in the box. Hard biscuits, but these are uniform, clean, clearly manufactured. A paper packet that smells like coffee. Small tablets, cigarettes. The other soldiers crowd around now. Everyone's opening boxes, pulling out contents with shaking hands. Someone finds the fruit bar, compressed dates or apricots, and bites into it. His eyes widen. Sugar. Real sugar, not the phantom ration that never appeared. Concentrated sweetness exploding in his mouth after months of bland rice. Another soldier tears open a pack of cigarettes. American cigarettes. He lights one, inhales, and for a moment just closes his eyes. The sergeant sits down heavily. He's done the calculation. He spreads out the contents of a single K ration box. one day's worth, in front of him. Then he pulls out his own ration pouch and empties it beside the American food. The contrast is obscene. His weekly ration, a small cloth bag of unhusked rice, maybe 2,800 grams total, 100 grams edible, after removing husks and debris. 2 dried fish heads, nothing else. That's it. That's what he's been living on. About 1,300 calories per day when stretched across the week. Barely enough to keep a man alive, let alone fighting. The American daily ration spread in front of him contains 3 cans of meat, each probably 50-70 grams, multiple packages of biscuits, fruit or cereal bars, coffee, sugar, chocolate. Everything packaged cleanly. No debris, no husks to remove, no rat droppings. He doesn't need to know the exact caloric count to understand what he's seeing. 1 American day equals his entire week. Maybe more. And this is portable rations, field rations, emergency rations. What are the Americans eating when they're not eating K-rations? The sergeant looks at his men. They're all thinking the same thing. You can see it in their faces. Everything they've been told is a lie. The Americans aren't weak. They're not soft. They're not dependent on luxury because they lack spiritual strength. They're stronger because they're better fed. They fight better because their commanders actually care, whether they live or die. They win because they have the industrial capacity to feed their soldiers real food, while the Imperial Army feeds its men rat-dropping contaminated rice and tells them their hunger makes them fierce. One of the privates says it out loud. "We've been starving while they eat like this?" The sergeant has no answer. What can he say? That command told them suffering builds character? That deprivation creates spiritual strength? These slogans sound hollow now, with American rations spread on the ground in front of them. The physical evidence is irrefutable. They eat. Of course they eat. They haven't had real meat in months, haven't tasted coffee or chocolate or anything with fat and flavor. They tear through the K-rations, like starving men do, because they are starving men. But even as they eat, something fundamental has shifted. The propaganda has broken, because you can tell soldiers that their enemy is weak and soft. You can tell them that hardship makes them superior. You can build an entire military philosophy around the nobility of suffering. But when those soldiers find crates of enemy rations, emergency rations, not even the good stuff, and realize that their enemy's worst food is better than their best food, something breaks. The cognitive dissonance is too great. Either command has been lying about American weakness, or command doesn't understand what's actually happening, or command knows and doesn't care that their soldiers are starving while the enemy is well fed. None of these options inspire confidence. Word spreads. It always does. Other units encounter American supply dumps, capture positions, find K-rations. Japanese officers try to control the narrative. They confiscate the American rations. They remind soldiers that material abundance is no substitute for spiritual strength. They punish those who openly question doctrine. But the damage is done. Because soldiers talk. In whispers, in quiet moments, they share what they've seen. They compare notes. They do the math. And they start to wonder, if command lied about the Americans being soft and weak, what else have they lied about? The full weight of the American logistical advantage became devastatingly clear in February 1945, when American forces liberated the internment camps in Manila, Santo Tomas, Los Baños, Billy Bede Prison. In these camps, thousands of American and Allied civilians had been held prisoner by the Japanese for 3 years. By the time liberation came, they were dying. The Japanese had been feeding them the soldier's ration. The same ration they claimed was equal to what Japanese soldiers received. Here's what that looked like in practice. By early 1945, internees at Santo Tomas were receiving between 700 and 800 calories per day, less than 20 grams of protein. The rice was unhusked palay rice that the starving prisoners had to process themselves, an expensive caloric effort for people who had no calories to spare. The vegetables were camote tops and talinum greens, boiled into a watery stew, sometimes containing shreds of carabao or fish heads with the eyes still intact. That was lunch. Often, it was the only meal. Internees were dying of starvation at an accelerating rate. Medical records documented the clinical signs: hunger, edema, that left emaciated bodies grotesquely swollen, night blindness, burning extremities, open tropical ulcers that wouldn't heal, dysentery, beriberi. When American tanks burst through the gates of Santo Tomas on February 3, 1945, the soldiers couldn't believe what they saw: walking skeletons, children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs, adults who could barely stand, faces showing every bone structure, eyes sunken deep, skin hanging loose. Their bodies were wasted by hunger, one account recorded. The youths were pale and gangling, and the old people were feeble and sick with diseases of malnutrition. The young American soldiers, most of them barely 20 years old, saw this and couldn't help themselves. They pulled out their K-rations, handed them to prisoners, gave away their chocolate bars, their canned meat, their cigarettes. Some soldiers emptied their pockets completely, giving away everything they had. The prisoners fell on the food like animals. They crammed their mouths full, sat down right there in the mud and dirt, and ate with shaking hands, weeping. The medical officers saw what was happening and tried to stop it. "Don't give them rich food," they shouted. "Their systems can't handle it." But it was too late. The damage was done, though not from malice, but from generosity. See, when someone has been starving for months, their digestive system shuts down. The stomach shrinks. The body loses its ability to process fats and proteins. Refeeding has to be done gradually. First gruel, then mush, then more substantial food over weeks. If you give a starving person a full meal, it can kill them. Several internees who ate K-rations immediately became violently ill. Some died, not from starvation, but from refeeding syndrome. Their bodies, pushed to the edge of death by Japanese rations, couldn't handle American abundance. The Army learned quickly. They set up proper feeding protocols. Started with thin rice gruel, then mush, then gradually more substantial fare. But the moral contrast was already clear to everyone present. The Japanese had deliberately starved these people for 3 years, feeding them less than what they claimed their own soldiers received, watching them die and calling it compliance with Geneva Convention standards. The Americans arrived with so much food that their surplus, given away carelessly in a burst of compassion, was literally too rich for starving bodies to handle. One philosophy said, "Make them endure. Hardship builds character." The other said, "Feed them, care for them, keep them alive." At Los Baños camp, liberated on February 23rd, the story was the same. Internees who'd been receiving a handful of unhusked rice per day suddenly found themselves surrounded by Americans handing out rations. Grace Nash, an internee at Los Baños, later wrote about that moment. After years of systematic starvation, after watching friends and family waste away, after the desperate hunger that consumed every waking thought, suddenly there were American soldiers, and they had food, real food, abundant food, more food than she'd seen in 3 years. The Americans had brought K-rations, of course, but also C rations, 10-in-1 rations, hot food from mobile kitchens, medical supplies, everything needed to begin saving lives. For the liberated prisoners, the K-rations represented something beyond nutrition. They represented a fundamental difference in how the two militaries viewed human life. The Japanese gave their own soldiers 1,300 calories of rice and fish heads, watched them develop beriberi and hunger edema, told them their suffering made them spiritually superior, and sent them to die. The Americans gave their soldiers 3,000 calories of complete nutrition in portable form, made sure every forward unit had surplus supplies, and when they found prisoners starving, immediately began feeding them, even knowing that some might die from the richness of the food after such prolonged starvation. One military ran on ideology, the other ran on logistics. The ideology lost. The K-ration story isn't just about food. It's a window into why Japan lost the Pacific War. Because the same philosophy that led Japanese command to starve their soldiers while calling it spiritual strength infected every aspect of their war effort. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. By 1944, Japan's logistical situation in the Pacific was collapsing. Not because they lacked resources. They'd conquered resource-rich territories throughout Southeast Asia. Not because they lacked food. The Philippines, Vietnam, and other occupied territories had plenty. They were collapsing because they couldn't get supplies where they needed to go. And this wasn't bad luck. It was the result of deliberate choices made years earlier. In the 1930s, as Japan prepared for war, their naval planners made a fateful decision: prioritize warships over cargo ships, build carriers and battleships and cruisers. Don't waste industrial capacity on unglamorous transport vessels. The logic seemed sound at the time. Win the decisive naval battles, and logistics would sort themselves out. But war doesn't work that way. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese cargo ships faster than Japan could replace them. The rice that was supposed to feed troops in the Philippines sat in warehouses in Vietnam because there weren't enough ships to transport it. Japanese forces in the Philippines, cut off from resupply, were left to forage and steal from local populations, which turned those populations against them, which created partisan resistance, which forced Japan to divert combat troops to rear area security, which weakened the front lines. A death spiral, all starting from inadequate logistics planning. The Americans, meanwhile, had spent the 1930s building the most sophisticated logistics system in military history. They built cargo ships by the hundreds, developed standardized containers, loading procedures, supply chains, created systems for tracking inventory, projecting needs, managing distribution. By 1944, American supply lines across the Pacific were so robust that frontline units had surplus. So efficient that K-rations, considered emergency food by American standards, were abundant enough to give away. The contrast extended beyond just food supplies. Japanese military command structure was a disaster. According to testimony from Japanese officers after the war, the Imperial Army suffered from chronic insubordination and unclear chains of command. Field commanders ignored orders from headquarters. Staff officers acted independently. Areas of responsibility were exceedingly ill-defined. Colonel Hayashi, a Japanese staff officer, described it bluntly. Headquarters staff officers pushed forward into domestic politics. Some of them actually acted as if they were themselves prime ministers or high commanders. Local commanders always exerted a more powerful local influence than did the high command itself. When things went wrong, culpability was hushed up. Responsibility was diffuse. This organizational chaos meant that even when food was available, it often didn't reach soldiers. Local commanders hoarded supplies. Transportation broke down. Orders were ignored. And at every level, the response was the same. Tell soldiers their hardship builds character. Tell them sacrifice is noble. Tell them the Americans are soft and weak. But the Americans weren't soft and weak. The Americans had generals who understood that soldiers need calories to fight, who built supply systems that could deliver K-rations to jungle outposts, who treated logistics as a core military competency, not an afterthought. The Americans had a command philosophy that said, take care of your soldiers, and they'll take care of the mission. The Japanese had a command philosophy that said, soldiers should accept suffering without complaint, and if they die with honor. One philosophy won wars, the other lost them. The human cost of Japan's approach was staggering. Japanese soldiers in the Philippines didn't die heroically in combat. They died of starvation and disease in far greater numbers than combat casualties. They died of beriberi because their rice-only diet lacked thiamine. They died of dysentery because malnutrition destroyed their immune systems. They died of infected wounds that wouldn't heal because their bodies lacked the protein to repair tissue. They died slowly, miserably, while their commanders told them their suffering made them spiritually superior to the well-fed Americans. And when those starving soldiers found American K-rations and realized how completely they'd been lied to, something fundamental broke. Not just morale, not just faith in their commanders, but the entire ideological framework that justified the war. Because if the propaganda about American weakness was a lie, and the K-rations proved it was, what else was a lie? The claim that Japan was winning? A lie. The claim that sacrifice would lead to victory? A lie. The claim that the imperial way was superior? A lie. All of it, revealed as hollow propaganda by the simple existence of well-fed enemy soldiers and starving Japanese ones. In the end, the K-ration story is about the collision of two worldviews. One side believed that material abundance made soldiers weak, that hardship built character, that spiritual strength could overcome physical deprivation. The other side believed that logistics win wars, that well-fed soldiers fight better than hungry ones, that victory comes from superior systems, not superior suffering. History rendered its verdict in 1945. The Japanese military, running on ideology and empty stomachs, collapsed. Soldiers who'd been told their hunger made them fierce died in their thousands of malnutrition and disease. Officers who'd preached spiritual superiority surrendered to enemies they'd mocked as soft. The Americans, running on industrial might and 3,000 calories per day, won decisively. Their K-rations, the emergency field rations they complained about, became a symbol of the overwhelming material advantage that defined the Pacific War. Private Yamamoto, who we met at the beginning of this story, survived the war. Years later, in an interview with historians, he described the moment he first saw American K-rations. "We thought they were weak," he said. "We thought we were strong because we could endure suffering they couldn't. But they weren't weak. They were smart. They fed their soldiers, so their soldiers could fight. We starved ours and called it strength." He paused, remembering. "When I saw what the Americans were eating, what they considered emergency rations, I knew we'd lost. Not just the battle, the war, everything. Because a military that feeds its soldiers like that understands something fundamental that ours didn't." "What's that?" the interviewer asked. "That you can't win a war with hungry men and empty promises." The lessons of the K-ration story echo today. Modern militaries, regardless of nationality, prioritize soldier nutrition and logistics. The MREs that descended from K-rations are sophisticated systems designed with input from nutritionists, food scientists, and soldiers themselves. No modern military tells its troops that hunger builds character. Because the experiment was run, the results are in. The side that fed its soldiers won. The side that starved its soldiers lost. And in between, scattered across 1,000 Pacific battlefields, were small cardboard boxes marked with a large K, containing more food than a Japanese soldier saw in a week, given away casually by Americans who considered them barely adequate. That's not a story about luxury versus hardship. That's a story about two different philosophies of war, tested in combat. One worked, one failed. And the men who fought and died under both learned the hard way which was which. Sometimes what looks like weakness is actually wisdom. Sometimes what's called soft is actually smart. And sometimes the soldiers, mocking their enemies' luxury, die hungry, while those soft enemies win the war. The K-ration box, small, waterproof, packed with more nutrition than a week of Japanese rations, stands as a monument to that truth. Simple, portable, abundant, and utterly devastating to every piece of propaganda the Imperial Japanese Army ever told its soldiers about American weakness.